In the winter of 1843, in a small New Hampshire village tucked between dense forests and icy hills, the world seemed as still and unremarkable as the snow blanketing its fields. The village was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and stories, a place seemingly untouched by time or turmoil. Yet beneath the calm surface, an uneasy tension had begun to take root, a quiet unease that no one dared to voice aloud. At the heart of this community stood Jonathan Reed, the schoolmaster, a man of measured speech and gentle manners, respected by villagers for his unwavering dedication to education and his seemingly unshakable composure. His presence was like the steady flame of a lantern in the dark, constant, reassuring, and yet impossible to look at too closely without sensing something distant, something quietly unsettling. The children who attended his school adored him, drawn to his calm authority and the stories he told. Stories that often lingered just beyond the edge of innocence. But when a harsh winter storm swept over the village, battering the rooftops and whipping icy winds through the trees, the village awoke to a chilling reality. Several children had vanished without a trace. Their absence was not announced by shouting or frantic searching at first. Instead, it was the stillness in their usual places, the empty spaces at the breakfast tables, and the silence in the schoolroom that gnawed at the villagers' hearts. Panic crept slowly into their minds as the snowstorm cut off easy travel and communication, leaving only whispered fears and half-seen shadows. Jonathan Reed remained outwardly composed, his eyes betraying no hint of the storm raging beneath his placid exterior. When villagers sought answers, he offered calm reassurances wrapped in cryptic words about protection and salvation, a strange philosophy that few fully understood but dared not challenge openly. The cold air seemed to thicken with questions no one dared voice aloud. Where were the children? What had happened to them in the storm's wake? And could the schoolmaster's eerie calm truly mask the dreadful truth behind their disappearance? The village held its breath, caught between hope and despair, as the snow piled higher and deeper, threatening to bury more than just the paths and homes. It threatened to bury the very souls of those lost beneath the winter's relentless grip. The ground beneath the deepest drift of snow was soft, disturbed in a way that no animal could have made. It was a dull, sinking pressure that drew the villagers out before dawn, their breaths sharp and visible in the freezing air, their eyes wide with dread. The children were found beneath the earth's cold grasp, not lifeless in the way death usually claims its victims, but buried alive, their small faces impossibly calm, as if they had been lulled into a deep, peaceful sleep. The scene was more than a grave. It was a carefully crafted tableau. Each child was laid out with deliberate precision, limbs arranged like a slow dance frozen in time, hands crossed over chests or palms turned gently upward. Around them, small tokens, delicate feathers, smooth river stones, strands of hair tied with ribbons, were placed in patterns that resembled ancient symbols. Symbols no one living could fully understand but felt instinctively wrong. Jonathan Reed stood among them, his eyes shadowed but steady, speaking softly of salvation and mercy, his words both a balm and a blade. To him, this burial was not death, but a crossing, a transformation where the children were spared the cruelties of a broken world. By entering a suspended peace beneath the soil, his philosophy twisted mercy into a slow, methodical cruelty, one where pain was masked by silence, where life and death blurred into a single haunting pause. The villagers' shock was palpable, but it slowly folded into a fearful curiosity as they grappled with the horror of a salvation so unnatural and deliberate. They whispered about the strange calmness on the children's faces, about the eerie ritual evident in the placement of their bodies. It was not just burial, it was a ceremony, a dark rite woven into the fabric of the frozen earth itself. The soil was thick with secrets, and beneath it the line between horror and hope dissolved into a cold, quiet stillness. Jonathan Reed's home was a shrine to a mind fractured by obsession and darkness, a place where innocence was twisted into ritual and science was bent to a sinister purpose. Hidden beneath layers of dust and shadow, investigators uncovered cryptic notes scrawled in Jonathan's meticulous hand. Pages filled with a disturbing blend of alchemical symbols, arcane diagrams, and medical sketches. These were not the writings of a simple schoolmaster, but of a man consumed by the idea that death was not an end, but a passage that could be controlled and manipulated through rituals that fused folklore with a dark form of science. The symbols etched into his journals were ancient, drawn from obscure traditions meant to guard souls as they passed into another realm, or so Jonathan believed. Among the writings, drawings of spirals, concentric circles, and interlocking shapes suggested a protective design, a sacred geometry meant to shield the buried children from malevolent forces, keeping them suspended in a supernatural limbo. Alongside these symbols were notes on herbs and oils and formulas for ointments and concoctions intended to preserve the body and spirit. Items discovered with the children, small carved talismans, feathers, and stones, were clearly placed with intention. Relics meant to act as anchors or wards against evil beyond the physical world. This macabre practice transformed the burial into a twisted ceremony, a slow descent into darkness surrounded by invisible safeguards designed by Jonathan's own fractured logic. The line between scientific method and ritual was blurred, revealing a psyche that sought to justify its cruelty as an act of mercy, a salvation both earthly and supernatural. The children were not simply hidden beneath the soil. They were encased within a carefully constructed framework of belief, trapped in a liminal space where Jonathan's warped faith held sway. This discovery deepened the horror. Not only had a man buried children alive, but he had done so with the deliberate intent of imprisoning their souls, condemning them to an endless, silent vigil beneath the earth. The village's fear grew, knowing that the surface calm of their schoolmaster masked a mind steeped in dark rituals and twisted salvation, a mind that had woven a nightmare both physical and spiritual from the threads of folklore and science. In the weeks that followed the children's burial, the village's fragile peace began to unravel under the weight of strange sounds that seeped from the frozen earth like whispers from another world. At night, faint cries rose and fell on the wind, soft and haunting, neither fully human nor wholly animal, drifting through the trees and weaving into the dreams of those who dared listen. These noises, barely more than breath and moan, stirred a growing dread among the villagers, a creeping certainty that what lay beneath the snow was not simply silent or still. The children, they feared, were trapped in some awful limbo, caught between worlds, and their suffering had not ended with the soil's cold embrace. When suspicion finally tipped into action, the school itself was searched, revealing a hidden chamber beneath its creaking floors, a shadowed sanctum built with cruel care. Inside, investigators found instruments that chilled the blood, handcrafted devices designed to strip away every sense but the barest flicker of life. These tools were primitive yet horrifying in their precision, a grotesque blend of science and sadism meant to isolate the mind, to drown it in darkness and silence. Jonathan Reed's experiments were not merely to preserve, but to torment, to prolong the flickering candle of consciousness while suffocating it in sensory deprivation. The chamber's walls were lined with contraptions that muffled sound, blackened the air, and immobilized bodies in ways that crushed hope and warped time itself. Here, the schoolmaster had perfected a unique cruelty, one where victims were left alive but utterly cut off from the world, abandoned in a void where pain was internalized and endless. This method of torture was not haphazard. It was deliberate, ritualistic, and a scientific invocation of isolation meant to break will and spirit. The villagers recoiled in horror as they pieced together the extent of Jonathan's madness. The cries in the night were not echoes of death, but the muted agony of souls suspended in a living nightmare. The schoolmaster's quiet facade, once a mask of normalcy and kindness, now revealed itself as a gateway to a darkness where mercy was twisted into a slow, silent horror. The village, once hopeful that their children might be spared, was left to reckon with a deeper terror. The understanding that beneath the surface, evil had flourished, methodical and unseen, a whisper that would never fully fade. Eliza's footsteps faltered beneath the weight of grief as she made her way to Jonathan Reed's austere home, a place that had once symbolized trust and learning, but now loomed like a mausoleum. Her child was among those buried beneath the frozen earth, and the unbearable silence pressed against her chest with every step. When she confronted Jonathan, there was no fury, no desperate pleading, only a hollow, aching sorrow that demanded answers from the man who spoke of salvation while burying innocence alive. Jonathan met her gaze with an unsettling calm, his voice steady and devoid of empathy as he explained the purpose behind his actions. To him, this was an act of mercy, a methodical preservation of fragile souls from a world rife with suffering and decay. His belief in his own salvation mission was not born of cruelty, but of a twisted logic that saw himself as both protector and executioner, a guardian guiding children beyond the reach of pain through a ritual that combined science and faith. Behind this chilling detachment lay a secret kept hidden in the pages of a diary, discovered later by those who sought to understand the man beneath the mask. Within its worn covers, Jonathan's past unfolded, a childhood scar etched not on skin but on the very fabric of his mind. Raised in a home where discipline was cold and affection scarce, his early encounters with death and decay planted seeds of obsession with control and mercy. The diary revealed his fascination with the boundary between life and death, a fascination that twisted into a cruel conviction that true mercy lay in erasing suffering through slow, deliberate silence. This warped sense of mercy was inseparable from his need for control. If he could dictate the terms of death, if he could choreograph the passage from life to oblivion, then he could deny the chaos and pain that had once haunted his own childhood. Eliza's despair clashed with Jonathan's cold certainty, exposing the fractured humanity beneath his calm exterior. In this exchange, the village's deepest fears found form, a man whose kindness was a mask for methodical cruelty, a psyche that saw salvation not as release but as imprisonment, and a legacy of suffering born from the desire to control what should never be controlled. The confrontation ended without resolution, the silence between them heavier than any words, as the shadow of Jonathan's twisted mercy settled like a permanent frost over the village and its grieving souls. The hidden chamber beneath the school was more than a dark room. It was a mausoleum of twisted science and ritual, a secret sanctum where Jonathan Reed's macabre mind had taken form in objects as chilling as his intentions. Within this subterranean space, the investigators uncovered instruments that defied simple explanation, each crafted with deliberate care to extend the fragile thread between life and death. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and something colder, an odor that hinted at long-absorbed blood and forgotten suffering. Among the tools was a contraption designed for the slow extraction of blood, a grim apparatus that operated in rhythmic pulses, meticulously calibrated to draw the vital fluid in measured amounts. This was no mere torture, it was a ritualized procedure, a scientific yet horrifying attempt to keep the body's life force flickering just enough to stave off decay while the earth claimed the rest. The method was cruelly elegant. By controlling the flow of blood, Jonathan sought to slow the inevitable breakdown of the body, preserving a husk suspended in time beneath the soil. The instruments bore engravings, symbols from his cryptic notes, linking the scientific practice with a spiritual purpose that only he could understand. Nearby shelves held tinctures and oils, concoctions of local herbs refined to numb pain, slow the heart rate, and dull consciousness without extinguishing it. The chamber was a laboratory of death deferred, where medical knowledge and ritual merged into a slow-burning cruelty designed to arrest time itself. The children buried in this unnatural state were not simply lifeless. They were caught in a liminal space crafted by Jonathan's obsessive will, trapped between worlds with their bodies maintained in a slow decay, their souls bound by the symbolic rites he performed. The discovery of the chamber laid bare the true horror of Jonathan's salvation, a salvation that was not released but endless suspension, a methodical imprisonment in darkness. This morbid fusion of science and ritual revealed a psyche so deeply fractured that mercy had become an instrument of control, and death itself was manipulated into a prolonged torment. The village, once hopeful for answers, was left to confront a nightmare born not of madness alone, but of a calculated, chilling intellect. A hidden chamber that held not only instruments, but the very essence of Jonathan Reed's methodical, ritualistic evil. Jonathan Reed's past was a tightly sealed chapter, whispered about only in fragments by those who had once crossed paths with him beyond the village schoolhouse. Before he took up the mantle of schoolmaster, he had apprenticed under a local physician, a man fascinated by the fragile line that separates life from death. Jonathan absorbed this obsession with quiet intensity, a fixation that soon twisted into something far darker. He came to believe that death was not an end, but a state to be manipulated, controlled, and ultimately suspended. His method was neither murder nor mercy. It was a calculated cruelty that sought to trap his victims between breaths, caught in a liminal state where consciousness faded but life did not fully cease. This was not killing in the ordinary sense. Jonathan administered a narcotic potion brewed from native herbs and refined into a potent elixir capable of slowing the heart and clouding the mind, yet preserving enough life for the body to remain alive beneath the earth. This slow burial was not a hurried act of violence, but a ritualistic procedure carried out with meticulous care. The children, barely conscious, were laid to rest beneath the soil in carefully measured depths, their bodies arranged to maintain fragile circulation, their breathing shallow and rhythmic beneath layers of cold dirt. To Jonathan, this was salvation, a merciful act that spared them the suffering of a cruel world, a way to hold them in a suspended embrace beyond pain, beyond time. The science behind his cruelty was cruelly elegant. He had studied anatomy and physiology well enough to understand how to keep life's faintest flicker alive in total darkness. But for the children, trapped beneath the earth, this was a slow, silent torment. Their minds were caught in shadows, aware yet unable to cry out, their bodies cold but not still, suspended in a living nightmare designed by a mind that saw itself as guardian and executioner. Jonathan's calm exterior masked the monstrous precision of a man who believed in control above all, who saw innocence as something to be preserved, even if that preservation meant a grave more terrifying than death itself. The village, once held together by shared loss and quiet hope, began to unravel completely under the unbearable weight of Jonathan Reed's actions and words. For many months, the community had lived with a fragile unity, bound by the grief of vanished children and the haunting mystery of their disappearance. But as more truth surfaced, the villagers found themselves deeply divided. Some still clung to Jonathan's claim that the children were not dead, but safe beneath the earth, spared from a world of pain and suffering through a ritualistic salvation. Others, horrified and desperate for justice, could not accept the idea that burying children alive could ever be mercy. The tension simmered, poisoning relationships and fostering fear, suspicion, and anger among neighbors and friends. On one side were those who believed that Jonathan Reed had acted out of a twisted compassion, a grotesque mercy born of his own fractured mind and warped philosophy. To them, the schoolmaster was a man who saw beyond the visible world, a man who believed that death was not an end, but a transition, a passage through which the children might be spared from future torment. His rituals, his scientific experiments, and his slow burials were all part of a grim plan to preserve their souls and bodies in a liminal state, caught between life and death but free from earthly suffering. These villagers sought solace in his words, perhaps as a way to protect themselves from the unbearable pain of accepting that their children had been cruelly imprisoned beneath the soil. On the other side stood a growing group determined to see Jonathan punished. They could not reconcile any kindness with the act of burying children alive, no matter how twisted his reasoning. To them, his salvation was a hideous lie, a facade masking calculated cruelty and obsession. They demanded a public reckoning, a trial that would hold the schoolmaster accountable and force the community to confront the full horror of what had been done. This faction feared that allowing Jonathan's beliefs to stand unchallenged risked perpetuating more suffering, more secrets, and more darkness. As tensions escalated, the village's once close-knit community began to fracture. Families who had once shared meals and prayers found themselves whispering accusations and doubts behind closed doors. The simple acts of daily life, passing in the market, gathering at the church, became fraught with unspoken fears, and the bitter knowledge that the evil they had ignored or misunderstood had lived among them, hidden behind the calm and respectable face of the schoolmaster. The long-awaited trial arrived like a shadow descending over the village, bringing with it a somber mood and a heavy silence. The courtroom was packed with villagers, some stoic, others trembling with emotion. The air was thick with a mix of grief, anger, and a desperate yearning for truth. The very walls seemed to hold their breath as if bearing witness to the unraveling of a nightmare too terrible to speak of openly. Jonathan Reed himself appeared before the court as composed and unshaken as ever. His calm demeanor unnerved many. He did not plead for forgiveness nor express remorse. Instead, he remained resolute, unwavering in his conviction that the children were indeed safe beneath the earth, spared from a cruel fate by his own hand. His detached manner only deepened the horror for the villagers, revealing a psyche utterly removed from the human anguish surrounding him. Witness after witness took the stand, each testimony peeling back layers of Jonathan's secret life. Villagers spoke of the hidden chamber beneath the school, the grotesque tools used to slow decay and maintain life's faint flicker even as bodies lay buried. They described the rituals Jonathan performed, the strange symbols, the measured placement of the children, and the narcotic concoctions designed to trap them between sleep and consciousness. Each account painted a picture of a man who had turned mercy into methodical cruelty and science into ritualized torture. More testimonies revealed that the known missing children were not the only victims. Some spoke of others who had vanished quietly over the years, their absences never questioned or fully understood. It became clear that Jonathan's dark mission had been ongoing, a pattern of salvation practiced in silence for far longer than anyone had suspected. The scale of the horror overwhelmed the courtroom, filling it with a psychological terror born not of sensational violence, but of a cold, calculated cruelty that corrupted innocence and twisted compassion. As the evidence mounted, it became impossible to see Jonathan Reed as anything other than a man who had weaponized mercy, a man who believed that controlling the boundary between life and death gave him the right to decide who should be spared and who should suffer. His salvation was not released. It was a slow, endless imprisonment beneath the earth. His actions left the village caught in a limbo of grief and outrage, struggling to comprehend a mercy so cruel that it was indistinguishable from evil. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the weight of collective grief, Jonathan remained steadfast in his belief, insisting that the children's souls were protected and that he had spared them from a world that would only cause pain. His cold certainty created a dissonance in the courtroom, a chilling reminder that evil often hides behind a mask of righteousness and conviction. The trial ended without a neat resolution or closure. The community were left with fractured trust, haunted memories, and the grim reality that a man they had trusted had inflicted a nightmare that would linger in their collective consciousness for generations. The breaking point was not just the moment of Jonathan's public unmasking, but the fracturing of a community forced to reckon with the darkest corners of human nature, where compassion can be twisted into cruelty, where control masquerades as kindness, and where the line between salvation and damnation blurs into a silent horror beneath the earth. This moment marked a turning point, a collective awakening to the dangers of silence, denial, and the dangerous allure of those who claim to know better than others what mercy truly means. The village would never be the same. The scars of Jonathan Reed's actions ran deep, shaping not only the lives of those who survived, but also the culture of suspicion and caution that followed. Memorials would be raised, laws reconsidered, and stories whispered in warning. Yet, the most haunting legacy was the question left unanswered in every whispered conversation and every lingering shadow. Could such a mind, so methodical and hidden behind normalcy, emerge again? Could salvation itself be a mask for unimaginable horror? The breaking point was not just a trial. It was a mirror held up to the fragile boundaries of human morality and the dark places where evil can dwell unnoticed. In the cold, dim confines of his cell, Jonathan Reed's confession unfolded not with panic or desperation, but with an eerie calmness that unsettled everyone who heard it. There was no frantic plea for mercy, no signs of remorse, only a steady voice that narrated his horrific deeds as if they were simple, rational acts performed out of necessity and kindness. The unsettling clarity in his eyes and the measured cadence of his speech revealed a mind profoundly detached from conventional human emotions, a psyche that had redefined cruelty as an act of salvation. To understand Jonathan's confession is to peer into the heart of a dark and methodical philosophy, one that saw death not as an end, but as a transformation, a ritual passage designed to liberate the soul from mortal suffering. Jonathan's belief centered on the concept of transcending the brutal randomness of human pain through controlled burial. He referred to the act of burying children alive as a second birth, a deliberate descent into darkness that was meant to sever them from the relentless torment of earthly existence. In his mind, this was not murder but a sacred ritual, a carefully orchestrated transition where the soul could awaken anew, free from the chains of physical pain and fear. This idea of rebirth through darkness was both chilling and unsettling, revealing a twisted logic that equated prolonged suffering with mercy. He explained how the ritual was designed to balance on the knife edge between life and death. Using narcotic herbs to induce a suspended animation, combined with a slow burial method, Jonathan sought to maintain the children's physical bodies in a state of limbo, neither fully alive nor completely dead. This delicate balance was intended to protect their souls from decay and suffering, preserving them in a silent sanctuary beneath the earth. In this space between worlds, Jonathan believed the children were safe, shielded from the cruelty of life by his scientific precision and ritualistic care. The horror lay not just in the physical act of burial, but in the psychological torment it represented, a deliberate imprisonment of innocence in a state of endless suspension. What made Jonathan's confession deeply disturbing was his lack of human empathy. His calm, almost clinical delivery stripped away the layers of typical emotional response, revealing a man whose moral compass was not guided by compassion but by an obsession with control and order. He saw himself as a guardian, a savior entrusted with a sacred duty to alleviate suffering by any means necessary. To Jonathan, the children were not victims but participants in a ritual that transcended ordinary understanding, and his actions were justified by a philosophy that placed spiritual salvation above all else. This ritualistic murder philosophy was rooted in Jonathan's belief that mortal pain was a curse from which he could save others. His methods, slow burial combined with narcotic sedation and symbolic rites, were carefully crafted to enforce this twisted mercy. Every action was deliberate, methodical, and performed with a conviction that blurred the lines between science, religion, and madness. The fusion of these elements in his mind created a worldview where cruelty was transformed into kindness, and evil was recast as an act of grace. The confession also shed light on Jonathan's profound detachment from the reality of his victim's suffering. He spoke of the children as though they were existing in a state beyond human experience, untouched by fear or pain. This disconnect highlighted the depth of his psychopathy, a capacity to rationalize horrific acts by denying the humanity of those he harmed. It revealed a mind so fractured that empathy was replaced by an abstract, clinical view of life and death as phenomena to be manipulated for a perceived greater good. Furthermore, Jonathan's calm acceptance of his actions suggested a chilling stability in his belief system. Unlike criminals driven by rage or desperation, his cold detachment indicated a long-standing conviction that his ritual was necessary and just. This unwavering belief added a layer of psychological terror to the confession, illustrating how deeply embedded his psychopathy was beneath a veneer of normalcy and respectability. The concept of a second birth in darkness as articulated by Jonathan blurred moral and existential boundaries. It forced those who listened to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of mercy, suffering, and control. Was there ever a justification for imposing such torment under the guise of salvation? Could evil truly masquerade as kindness when cloaked in ritual and scientific precision? Jonathan's confession challenged the community and the audience to grapple with the horrifying possibility that such a mindset could exist in seemingly ordinary people. His philosophy also revealed how evil can operate silently, hidden behind masks of normalcy and rationality. Jonathan's role as a schoolmaster, a figure of trust and education, made his crimes all the more insidious. The confession exposed the terrifying reality that profound malevolence can dwell beneath the most unassuming surfaces, camouflaged by intellect and calm demeanor. It was a stark reminder of how easily a community can be deceived by appearances and how deeply dangerous twisted minds can be when they wield knowledge and power without empathy. The emotional weight of Jonathan's confession left a lasting impact on the village and all who heard it. It was not a moment of closure, but an opening into a deeper abyss of understanding. A confrontation with the complex, unsettling nature of evil that does not roar but whispers, that does not act impulsively but with calculated care. His words lingered like a shadow, haunting the collective memory of the community and raising profound questions about the fragility of human morality. Ultimately, Jonathan Reed's confession in the dark was a chilling testament to the power of a methodical, ritualistic mind, to redefine cruelty as mercy and to impose a terrifying vision of salvation through suffering. It was a window into the psychology of a man who believed he could control the boundary between life and death, and in doing so, inflicted horrors that blurred the line between compassion and malevolence. This confession did not offer answers or absolution, but instead forced a reckoning with the darkest potential of the human mind and the silent, methodical evil that can lurk beneath the guise of normalcy. Years after the horrifying revelations of Jonathan Reed's crimes, the small village in New Hampshire remained haunted by the echoes of its darkest chapter. Time did little to erase the wounds that ran deep beneath the surface, and the trauma became an inseparable part of the community's collective memory. What began as a tightly knit village bound by shared hopes and simple rhythms of life was irrevocably changed by the chilling knowledge that beneath their very feet lay children buried alive, victims of a man who cloaked his cruelty in the guise of mercy. This legacy was unseen yet profoundly felt, shaping every aspect of the village's existence long after the last trial ended and the final testimonies faded. The buried children became more than just a tragic fact. They transformed into a somber local legend, a whisper passed down through generations. Their resting place, a quiet field once filled with life, was marked by an unspoken reverence and sorrow. Families spoke of them in hushed tones, and the story became a grim reminder of the delicate boundary between innocence and malevolence. Parents watched their own children with new fear and tenderness, knowing that even those who seemed most normal could harbor unfathomable darkness. This tale was no longer just about loss. It was about the fragility of trust and the dangers of blind faith in appearances. The trauma extended far beyond grief. It bred a profound sense of guilt and failure within the community. How had Jonathan Reed's cruelty gone unnoticed for so long? How had the villagers missed the signs, ignored the whispers, or convinced themselves that such evil could not exist in their midst? These questions lingered like shadows, eroding the community's confidence in their own judgment and in the social structures meant to protect the vulnerable. The quiet acceptance of Jonathan as a respected schoolmaster had enabled him to operate with terrifying freedom, and this realization shattered the village's sense of security. In response to this profound failure, the village, along with broader regional authorities, undertook significant changes aimed at preventing a recurrence of such tragedy. Laws surrounding child protection were rewritten and strengthened. New mandates required more vigilant oversight of children's welfare, with an emphasis on proactive intervention rather than reactive response. These laws sought to empower neighbors, teachers, and officials to question, investigate, and act whenever a child's safety was in doubt, no matter how subtle or hidden the threat might be. The horrific legacy of Jonathan Reed served as a catalyst for a cultural shift, one that recognized the necessity of constant vigilance and the danger of complacency. Mental health awareness also slowly began to gain traction within the village and surrounding areas. The story of Jonathan Reed revealed not only a failure to protect children, but also a deeper ignorance about the complexities of the human mind. Understanding the psychopathy and ritualistic cruelty behind his actions forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about mental illness and the potential for hidden malevolence within seemingly ordinary individuals. Clinics and schools began incorporating more education about psychological health, early warning signs of dangerous behavior, and the importance of addressing mental illness with care rather than stigma. These efforts were imperfect and gradual, but represented a critical step toward recognizing the unseen dimensions of evil. What remained most haunting, however, was the knowledge that Jonathan Reed's evil operated silently and methodically, hidden beneath a mask of normalcy and good intentions. This realization struck at the very core of the village's understanding of safety and trust. The man who committed these atrocities was not a monstrous outcast, but a respected figure, a schoolmaster entrusted with the care and education of children. His calm demeanor, intellectual manner, and social standing had allowed him to conceal his true nature, manipulate perceptions, and avoid suspicion. His story illustrated a terrifying truth: that evil can be patient, cunning, and camouflaged by the everyday. It reminded the village, and by extension all who heard the tale, that appearances can be deceiving and that darkness does not always announce itself with violence or loud defiance. This hidden legacy instilled a cautious vigilance within the village's culture. Parents became watchful, communities grew more insistent on accountability, and trust was tempered by a sobering awareness of human complexity. Yet this vigilance was tinged with sadness, an acknowledgement that innocence was lost not just to Jonathan Reed, but to the very nature of the world they inhabited. The story's silent echo served as a warning that evil's quietest forms could be the most dangerous because they are easiest to ignore or rationalize. The village's grappling with this legacy was not merely about trauma or legal reform, it was a profound moral reckoning. The people learnt that salvation claimed through cruelty was no salvation at all. Jonathan's claim that he was offering mercy through ritualistic burial was a grotesque distortion of kindness, a perversion of compassion that inflicted slow, calculated torment. This understanding forced the community to rethink fundamental questions about mercy, justice, and human dignity. It revealed the dangers of allowing ideology, no matter how seemingly benevolent, to justify harm and control over others. The legacy became a meditation on how easily moral lines can blur when power is wielded without empathy. The village's experience also highlighted the role of silence and denial in allowing evil to thrive. For years, suspicions and oddities were overlooked, dismissed, or hidden beneath the weight of social respectability and fear. Jonathan Reed's case underscored how dangerous it is to ignore the uncomfortable or inconvenient truths within one's own community. The legacy was a call to break the silence, to speak openly about fears and doubts, and to scrutinize even the most trusted figures. It was a reminder that evil often grows in the spaces where vigilance falters and where normalcy is accepted without question. Despite the sorrow and fear, the village also found in this legacy a quiet strength, a resolve to honor the buried children by safeguarding future generations. Memorials were erected, not just as markers of loss, but as symbols of collective responsibility and remembrance. The community pledged to carry the memory of those children as a solemn duty to protect the living. This commitment was both an act of healing and a defiant stand against the darkness that once consumed their home. The unseen legacy of Jonathan Reed was above all a story of complexity, of how evil can be masked by everyday faces, how trauma reshapes communities and how the pursuit of justice and healing is often a slow, painful process. It challenged the village to look inward, to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and societal failure, and to emerge with a more cautious, informed, and compassionate outlook. The legacy was a living reminder that vigilance must be constant, that kindness must be genuine, and that evil, no matter how quietly it moves, must never be allowed to hide in the shadows. In the end, the village's grappling with this unseen legacy was more than history. It was a warning and a lesson for all who listen. It spoke to the enduring danger of evil hidden beneath normalcy, the fragility of trust, and the profound responsibility communities bear to see beyond appearances. The children buried beneath the earth were gone, but their story remained, a silent call to vigilance, remembrance, and the unwavering pursuit of truth and protection. Jonathan Reed's dark legacy was not merely the result of cruel impulses or unrestrained madness. Instead, his crimes revealed the workings of a deeply methodical, coldly intellectual mind that sought to manipulate the very essence of life and death. To understand the full horror of his acts, it is essential to examine the peculiar and uniquely imagined methods he employed. Methods that blurred the boundaries between rudimentary science, ritual, and psychological torture in ways both grotesque and haunting. His blend of scientific experimentation and ritualistic cruelty crafted a slow, deliberate form of suffering that was far worse than immediate death, inflicting profound terror and despair through suspended animation and sensory deprivation. At the heart of Jonathan's method was his use of a narcotic concoction derived from local herbs and crude chemical experimentation. This potion was designed not to kill, but to induce a state of suspended animation in his victims, a condition where the body's vital functions slowed dramatically. Heart rates dropped, breathing became shallow and nearly imperceptible, and consciousness faded into a hazy half-dream. To an observer, these children appeared as if they were in a peaceful sleep, their bodies motionless, their faces serene. This illusion of calm, however, masked an unspeakable horror. The victims were alive, caught in a limbo between waking and death, unable to move or scream, trapped in their own helplessness. This was no accidental side effect, but a calculated cruelty. Jonathan's background as a medical apprentice gave him rudimentary knowledge of physiology and pharmacology, which he twisted into instruments of torment. His concoction was a primitive form of suspended animation, no modern medicine, but effective enough to deceive the senses and delay death for hours, even days. This cruel pause was the first step in his ritualistic process, prolonging the victim's agony and blurring their experience of time. The slow decay of consciousness under sedation turned the children's final moments into an endless, suspended nightmare where pain and terror simmered beneath a fragile veil of unconsciousness. Once sedated, the children were buried alive but not simply placed in the earth. Jonathan's ritualistic approach extended to the design and preparation of the graves themselves. These pits were carefully constructed to avoid immediate crushing or suffocation. Instead, the victims were enclosed in tight spaces where the weight of the soil pressed steadily but gently. This pressure was enough to restrict movement and breathing, but not enough to cause a quick death. The darkness was complete and absolute. No light, no air movement, no sound beyond the oppressive silence. The sensory deprivation was a deliberate torture technique, stripping the children of all external stimuli, severing their connection to the outside world. Psychologically, this deprivation created an unbearable experience. Human beings rely on sensory input to maintain orientation and sanity. Deprived of sight, sound, and touch, the mind begins to turn inward. In this void, fear and panic grow unchecked. Time distorts, and the victims would have faced an endless, oppressive silence where hope and memory alike faded into darkness. Jonathan's method exploited primal fears, fear of the dark, fear of isolation, fear of suffocation, to inflict not only physical pain but also a slow unraveling of the mind itself. The children were left to confront death not as a sudden event, but as an agonizing, drawn-out passage into oblivion with no comfort or reprieve. Adding a further layer of horror, Jonathan incorporated ritualistic elements grounded in a twisted mixture of alchemy, folklore, and his own delusions of salvation. He placed symbolic items beside the buried children, objects intended to protect their souls and guide them through a supernatural limbo. These tokens were drawn from obscure sources, primitive medical diagrams, arcane symbols from local legends, and crude alchemical references. For Jonathan, these items transformed the burials from mere killings into ritual sacrifices or acts of mercy. He believed he was preserving the children's souls, granting them a second birth through the darkness of the earth. This ritualistic dimension served a dual purpose. It provided Jonathan a framework to justify his actions, a moral and spiritual veneer that masked the brutal reality beneath. To outsiders, his words about salvation and protection might have sounded like madness or delusion, but to Jonathan they were sincere convictions. He saw himself as a savior, a master of life and death who transcended ordinary human cruelty. At the same time, the rituals functioned as psychological control mechanisms, both for Jonathan himself and for those who might witness or learn of his deeds. They elevated the crimes beyond mere murder, imbuing them with a dark meaning that made them all the more chilling. Jonathan's unique fusion of science and ritual created a method of torture and killing that was unprecedented. Unlike common forms of violence, which often stem from rage or impulse, his acts were slow, calculated, and deeply symbolic. They targeted the victims not just physically but mentally and spiritually, extending suffering over time and stripping away every layer of hope. The cruelty was scientific in its precision and ritualistic in its solemnity, reflecting a mind that sought not just to kill but to transform suffering into a perverse form of sanctity. This approach challenges traditional conceptions of evil as chaotic or purely instinctual. Jonathan Reed's crimes demonstrate that evil can also be intellectual and deliberate, driven by a cold, calculating desire to impose one's will over others in the most intimate and terrifying ways. His actions reveal a psyche that twisted knowledge and ritual into tools of torment, creating a horror that was as methodical as it was monstrous. The psychological horror of his methods, prolonged suspended animation, slow burial, and sensory deprivation, were innovations in cruelty, uniquely designed to maximize helplessness and despair. In uncovering these methods, investigators and historians confront a difficult truth about the nature of evil. It can wear the mask of normalcy and intellect, hiding behind the facade of science, tradition, or mercy. It can infiltrate communities under the guise of good intentions and respected authority, manipulating symbols and knowledge to justify unimaginable acts. Jonathan's legacy is a haunting reminder that evil is not always raw or visible but can be quiet, patient, and methodical, hiding in plain sight while meticulously planning its cruelty. The story of Jonathan Reed forces us to examine how knowledge itself can be twisted into instruments of horror, and how rituals can serve as psychological armor for the darkest impulses. It challenges us to recognize that true evil often operates not through loud violence but through silent, carefully crafted torment that preys on the deepest fears of isolation and helplessness. The science of evil in this case was a terrifying blend of cold experimentation and spiritual perversion, creating a nightmare that extended beyond death, leaving victims trapped in a slow, unending limbo. This chapter's investigation into Jonathan's methods reveals the depths of his macabre mind, his need for control, his obsession with the boundary between life and death, and his warped belief in salvation through suffering. It is a study of cruelty that transcends physical violence to encompass psychological torture and ritual sacrifice, a form of evil that is both intellectual and profoundly disturbing. The methods he devised were not merely acts of killing, but carefully constructed ceremonies of torment, designed to haunt the living and the dead alike. In the final analysis, Jonathan Reed's Science of Evil stands as a chilling testament to how methodical, ritualistic cruelty can be wielded by a mind that hides behind the mask of normalcy. It reminds us that evil can be patient and precise, combining ancient superstition with crude science to create a uniquely terrifying form of suffering. This legacy is not just a story of past horror, but a warning for the future, of the dangers posed when knowledge is corrupted, rituals are weaponized, and mercy becomes a guise for unimaginable torment. In every community there are shadows, silent, unseen, yet ever present. These shadows often conceal not just fear or the unknown, but something far darker, the evil that hides behind familiar faces and trusted roles. Jonathan Reed was one such shadow. To his neighbors in that quiet New Hampshire village, he was the schoolmaster, a man of order, calmness, and discipline, entrusted with the care and education of their children. Beneath this mask of normalcy, however, lay a mind capable of calculated horror, a darkness so methodical and ritualistic that it defied easy understanding. It is a chilling reminder of how evil can thrive, not in the depths of wilderness or in distant places, but in plain sight, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Evil like Jonathan's does not roar, it whispers. It does not break down doors, but instead uses the doors opened to it by society's trust. The villagers, wrapped in their routines and faith in their community, could not fathom the cruelty that existed beneath the schoolmaster's serene exterior. Their blindness was not ignorance, but a complex weaving of hope, denial, and the comforting belief that those who care for children cannot be monsters. This societal blindness creates fertile ground for evil to grow, nourished by assumptions that kindness must be kindness and order must be safety. Jonathan's ritualistic cruelty exploited this trust, cloaking murder in the guise of salvation and turning burial into a twisted act of mercy. This kind of evil operates like a shadow at twilight, neither fully revealed nor fully hidden. It exists in the gray areas of morality and human behavior, where intentions become twisted and the line between care and control blurs. Jonathan's actions were not random acts of violence, but a carefully constructed philosophy. He believed that by controlling life's end through ritual and science, he was sparing his victims from greater suffering, granting them peace through a second birth in the darkness beneath the earth. In this warped worldview, the horrors inflicted became acts of compassion, and the grave was transformed into a sanctuary. This dissonance between perception and reality is a hallmark of such macabre minds, the ability to rationalize evil as good and cruelty as salvation. The rituals themselves served multiple purposes. They masked the physical horror with symbolism, creating a barrier that distanced the perpetrator from the visceral reality of his crimes. Ritual offers structure, an illusion of order in chaos, and for Jonathan it was a means of imposing meaning on suffering. The objects buried with the children were talismans not only for their souls, but also for his own psyche, anchors that justified and contained his actions. Through ritual, he exercised ultimate control, orchestrating not just death, but the spiritual fate of his victims according to his own perverse logic. This dark choreography of suffering underscores how ritualistic cruelty can transform the monstrous into the methodical, the chaotic into the calculated. Jonathan's case is a stark example of how evil can wear the mask of normalcy and even kindness, using the tools of trust and routine to conceal itself. It challenges the comforting notion that monsters live far away, in shadows at the edge of civilization. Instead, it suggests that such darkness can reside within the very institutions designed to nurture and protect. When a community places unquestioning faith in those who hold authority, be it a schoolmaster, a healer, or a religious figure, there is a risk that this faith can be manipulated, exploited by minds that see order and compassion not as ends, but as means to control and destroy. Reflecting on this, one must consider the fragile nature of societal trust and the dangers of complacency. Evil thrives in silence and secrecy, fed by the reluctance to question those we believe in. It hides behind smiles and discipline, behind tradition and reason, and sometimes behind the very rituals that claim to bring peace. The horror is not only in the acts themselves, but in how easily such acts can be concealed, rationalized, and accepted under false pretenses. Jonathan's story is a haunting lesson in the need for vigilance, critical thought, and the courage to see beyond appearances. Yet in this darkness there is also a call for reflection on human nature, the dual capacity for good and evil that resides in all of us. The very rituals and sciences Jonathan perverted are human inventions, tools that can heal or harm depending on intention. His distorted mercy reveals how fragile the boundary is between compassion and cruelty when warped by obsession and madness. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how easily trust can be weaponized and how the quest for control can become a descent into inhumanity. As the village remembers the buried children and the shadow that claimed them, their story remains a solemn warning. Evil does not always announce itself with thunder or violence. Sometimes it creeps quietly in the guise of order, calm, and care. It is the silent shadow that lurks behind the faces we know, the unsettling presence in places we least expect. Recognizing this shadow is the first step toward preventing its return. In the end, Jonathan Reed's legacy is not just a tale of horror, but a mirror held up to society, reflecting the dangers of blind trust, the perils of ignoring discomforting truths, and the haunting reality that evil can flourish in the most ordinary places. His story urges us to ask, how often do we overlook shadows in favor of light? How often do we mistake silence for peace? And most importantly, how do we protect ourselves and future generations from the silent shadows that may still walk among us? The village gathered in the fading light, the air thick with sorrow that no words could ease. A simple memorial was laid, stones arranged carefully around a weathered tree, carved with the names of the children who never returned from beneath the snow. Each name etched into the rough wood carried a weight far heavier than the years could erase. Families placed wildflowers brittle from the cold, and a single candle flickered in the gathering dusk, its fragile flame struggling against the creeping chill. This quiet ritual, meant to bring closure, only deepened the shadows that lingered in the hearts of those left behind. The earth had swallowed more than bodies. It had claimed innocence and trust, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any scream. Beneath the surface of the village's peaceful facade, a darkness remained. A shadow cast not just by the winter's long nights, but by the knowledge that evil had walked openly among them, hidden beneath the calm eyes of the schoolmaster. This silence was not empty. It was charged with the echoes of fear, regret, and a profound unease. The villagers, once united by simple routines and shared faith, found themselves fractured by suspicion and grief. They spoke less of Jonathan Reed, but his presence haunted every corner of the village as if the earth itself whispered warnings beneath the stone memorials. The calm exterior he had worn like a mask was now stripped away, revealing the cold, methodical mind that had turned mercy into murder and order into ritualized horror. The questions left unanswered clung to the wind. How could such darkness dwell unnoticed? How could a man entrusted with their children be capable of such monstrous acts? The answers were tangled in the very fabric of human nature, how evil often hides not in the obvious places but behind the most ordinary masks. As the seasons turned, the village struggled to move forward, but the scars remained. Laws were changed and watchfulness increased, yet the sense of vulnerability endured. The memorial became a place of silent reflection, a reminder that evil is not always a distant story but can be born in the heart of familiarity, nurtured by trust and silence. The children's graves, once hidden beneath the snow, now stood as solemn testimony to a truth too painful to forget. That beneath the surface of normalcy there can exist an unfathomable darkness waiting to be unveiled. The rituals Jonathan had performed and the cold science twisted into mercy all served as a grim blueprint of how cruelty can masquerade as salvation, how order can conceal chaos, and how control can be wielded as a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. This story is not only about a single man or a single village, but about the delicate balance between trust and vigilance. It asks us to confront a difficult truth. that evil can wear the most unsuspecting faces, and that silence and denial may give it the room it needs to grow. The quiet horrors of Jonathan's mind were born from a fractured psyche that believed in a perverse mercy, but they were enabled by a community unprepared to see beyond appearances. The haunting silence left behind is not just a reminder of past tragedy. It is a call to awareness, a plea to look deeper, to question more, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves from shadows that hide in plain sight. As the night falls on this quiet village, the candle flickers once more, fragile but unyielding, much like the memory of the children and the lessons their fate imparts. It is an invitation to look beyond comfort and familiarity, to hold space for difficult truths, and to remember that vigilance is the only safeguard against shadows that could, without warning, emerge again. What do you think? Could such a darkness rise once more, hidden behind a gentle smile, waiting for the moment when silence and trust become its accomplices? The answer lies not in history alone, but in the choices we make today.